of the fact that the Met Service has issued an advisory that residents, especially in inland areas, are advised to remain hydrated and avoid direct sunlight as much as possible. And also, a very important reminder that the risk for forest fires will remain high. All right, so that's our weather update for today, courtesy of forecaster Michael Gentle. 104 inland, and that's not even, you know, the feel like that you see in your app, which counts for the humidity that you feel. That's a very hot day.
My friends in Belmopan are having a tough time with the excess heat.
Yeah, and you know,
it's nothing they're not used to, but
and it is something that we see around this time of year. We just hope that people pay attention to the additional advisory from the Met Service. Staying hydrated when it's very warm is important. Two groups especially are at risk for heat-related illnesses, and that would be the elderly and young children. So do ensure and check in on them that they're drinking enough water. The forest fire issue is also another one. We know that there continues to be a challenge in getting people to understand that there's a high risk right now for forest fires, and that you shouldn't be burning anything in your neighborhood, even in your farms at this time, because there's the potential for it to get out of control.
The ministry had issued,
imagine being hot and also breathing in that air.
The ministry had issued a statement or a release on Friday with respect of burning at this time of year, and the number of fires that they had to put out or that were recorded last week. It's interesting. It's very dry, to say the least.
Yeah, and you know, I remember the Forest Department being here just reminding us that essentially all of these fires are man-made. They may seem like they're in a random space, but they're pretty much just fires that get out of control, or somebody has started something in their yard or on their farm, and then it causes greater problems. We don't need people to be breathing in that type of air, especially when we're looking at trying to keep people as healthy as possible to ward off the current pandemic.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to get moving now into our eye-opener for this morning, and so a bit of motivation to get you started. And our eye-opener, taken from dailyom.com, goes like this. Often it takes something major to wake us up as we struggle to maintain an illusion of control. In life, most of us want things to go to the places we have envisioned ourselves going. We have plans and visions, some of them divinely inspired, that we want to see through to completion. We want to be happy, successful, and healthy, all of which are perfectly natural and perfectly human. So when life takes us to places we didn't consciously want to go, we often feel as if something has gone wrong, or we must have made a mistake somewhere along the line, or any number of other disheartening possibilities. This is just life's way of taking us to a place we need to go, for reasons that go deeper than our own ability to reason. These hard knocks and trials are designed to shed light on our unconscious workings and deepen our experience of reality. We can take our inspiration from any fairy tale that finds its central character lost in a dark wood, frightened and alone. We know that the journey through the woods provides its own kind of beauty and richness. On the other side, we will emerge transformed, lighter and brighter, braver and more confident for having moved through that darkness.
So the darkness represents the proverbial odds, right? And so being able to overcome those odds or those obstacles allow for us to come out on the other end more complete, in a manner of speaking, having gone through that experience. But the opening line of the eye-opener, where it says, often it takes something major to wake us up as we struggle to maintain an illusion of control, to me is powerful, because it is also fitting, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
When we look at the current situation that has befallen the world, and when we look at how we are impacted by it directly as a country and as a people, this first line speaks volumes, because when you look at what those in authority are doing, the government and all the other functionaries, when you look at what they are doing in the context of this coronavirus pandemic, the pandemic itself is the major event that wakes us up. And so all the efforts that are in place to try to ensure that we remain healthy, we remain safe, is the government, in a sense, trying to hold on to the control to make sure that everything goes well with the most minimal outcome in terms of lives lost and what have you. So I look at it that way, and I contextualize it by using the current situation that we're all facing. But for me, Marlene, the eye-opener is an interesting and a unique one.
Yeah, when it talks about that hard blow that comes at you, I think we've all been there.
Yeah.
We've all, and that's the thing that unites us in humanity. We have very different experiences, but we tend to have similar emotions about them. We've all had something just come and blindside you. You weren't expecting it, you weren't prepared for it. And it can be, in this time, job loss. It can be lots of other challenges that you may be going through at this time. And we have to just deal with it. There's nothing else you can do. It's one of those moments, exactly as it says in the opening, where you realize, as much as I think I'm in control, I'm not. There are environmental factors. There's kind of the wider community factors that will just completely change your course. But what I love about it is just the reminder that we have. If we look back to what would have been perhaps our hardest time, because we can all think of something that was really difficult, losing a loved one, losing a job, losing a relationship, losing anything that made you experience grief. And you thought that you'd never get through it, but you did. And most of the times you're able to say that we came out on the other end better off.
Yeah.
And so that's what the eye-opener talks about, and I think it's something that we can keep into perspective right now. So it's hard right now, and it's hard for people in many different ways. There are varying degrees of challenges, from people who don't have enough to feed their families, to people who don't have jobs, to people who don't have their businesses up and running, who are losing money, people who have to fire employees. People who had plans for 2020 that are somehow out the door and left in uncertainty at this time. All of that is a lot to cope with, but what we do have to remember, like all of our most trying times, we always came out better on the other end. So let's learn the lesson from this right now and stick it out.
Yeah.
That's what we got to do.
Lighter and braver.
That's right. And in fact, there's quite a bit to get into. We got to refocus ourselves. It is a Monday morning, and so we're going to bring to you some of the bigger stories from the news, national issues that we'll probably be talking about this week and that we started talking about last week. So let's shift gears to the Eye on the News.
All right, so I'll begin this morning by speaking firstly on the return of a number of people who were on the island of Ambergris Caye over the past several weeks, who we would say perhaps were stuck there for some time, following the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Belize. These individuals, a majority of whom were there on the island for work and for other reasons, were allowed to return to mainland on Saturday. And so there was a huge presence of persons returning from the island to the water taxi terminal here in Belize City. And what is interesting about this, Marlene, is the fact that I spoke with Greg Chuck on Friday. He is the former executive director for SATIM, the Sarstoon and Tamash Institute for Indigenous Management. And he was sharing that there are a number of communities in South, in the Toledo district, where persons had left those villages to go in search of jobs elsewhere in the country, including San Pedro, based on the tourism and the hospitality industry. And so these persons, or some of these persons, are now coming back to mainland and are heading south. And so one of the concerns among the villagers in the south is that perhaps these persons who have been exposed to whatever is happening on the island are now returning home, and it creates some kind of a situation for them, an issue for them, right? Well, notwithstanding the fact that the case was contained fairly quickly in San Pedro, so it limited the exposure of whomever the first or the index patient came into contact with. And so perhaps that's not necessarily a need for worry. But going back to what we're looking at here is essentially like the repatriation of persons from San Pedro back to Belize and other parts of the country.
How many people?
I don't have a head count per se. Suffice to say, several dozens of people were allowed to.
It was one boat?
I am assuming it's several.
Okay.
Right? The full extent of what transpired on Saturday, we will pursue today as a news story. What we have is just the visuals of their arrival at the water taxi terminal here in Belize City. So you're seeing several buses there, so it's suggestive that it's perhaps well over 100 plus people.
There's that sign non-stop. In fact, I saw a video of the police escorting the buses out onto the main highways. So clearly they were taking precaution that none of these people would just come and loiter around the city. They'd go back to where, in fact, they do live. And
I'm assuming as well, too, that the idea of social distancing on board the bus was in full exercise, right? Considering the fact that that is the modus operandi right now in terms of the movement of people in large groups, right? So that was Saturday, right? I'm not sure if this is the totality of persons on the island or if there will be another round. We're not certain as yet. Perhaps we can get that information a little bit later in the day as well as to this particular exercise. So the other point that I wanted to touch on, since we're discussing all things coronavirus for the past several weeks, on Friday as well, I had the opportunity to sit with the Attorney General. He's also the Minister of National Security. And we would have been more or less at the halfway point of the state of emergency, right? So I had asked him, the Honorable Mike Perfeet, to give us an overview or perhaps an evaluation of where we are thus far, with 2 more weeks to go and additional measures coming into force as of Friday as well. So we'll go to an interview with the AG where he gives us sort of a synopsis of where we are and what we can look forward to in the remaining weeks.
We cannot take our eye off the ball. I have to commend the national security apparatus for doing all that we can to ensure that we maintain law and order in this most unwanted type of circumstances. We have been doing our extreme best. Practically myself, Colonel Lovell, Colonel Enriquez, the Solicitor General, all of us, we practically are working 24 hours a day. Much credit has to be given to the Commissioner of Police, Captain Bennett from the Coast Guard, and General Ortega. All those people who I mentioned, we are never unaware of what's going on and never not ready to take any step we may need to step at any given time of the night or day to make sure that we enforce the protocols and that people are following the statutory instrument that is for their protection and health and benefit. So I would say give maximum kudos and respect to the security forces, especially those on the front line. I think we're doing the best that we can do. Not everyone will be happy with the measures that we take and what we have to do to maintain that, but we believe that this is necessary to protect everyone in the country, and we hope that people understand that what we're doing although inconvenient at times, it is in the best interest of your health and your well-being. I mean, I would think that people would accept that it's better to deal with some inconveniences rather than contract this disease that could kill you.
And finally, I know you have... All right, so that is an overview of where we are thus far insofar as the state of emergency. And he gives credit to the national security apparatus, which includes the Belize Police Department, the Belize Defense Force, and the Belize Coast Guard for doing their work.
Absolutely. And I think what he opened with is the most important point, which is we can't drop the ball. There is a reason we are under a lockdown. That lockdown should come to an end. It's the end of this week, I believe. I don't know what will happen in terms of extension. It started on the 11th, and it was for 14 days. So we'll see in 5 or 6 days what they decide to do in terms of extending it. The state of emergency was supposed to go to May 2nd, and some clarity as to what will happen, I guess we'll get by the end of the week. But I do want to say, while naturally the Minister of National Security gives credence to and give kudos to the police department, which is important, I think we should also thank the people. I mean, I feel oftentimes that when the conversation arises about people staying home, we're talked to in a very punitive way, like everyone is breaking the rules. But here's the thing, we have 400, 500 arrests, and those people needed, if they broke curfew, they needed to be picked up because we have the laws in place. But by and large, people are adhering, and I think we should never miss the opportunity to say great work to the citizens of this country, and also to keep it going. You know, we've done it since the beginning of this month, and we need to follow through for as long as possible. So where less than 1% has broken the curfew and the regulations, over 99% of people have adhered to them. And we must acknowledge that Belizeans are taking it serious, and we hope that they continue to do so.
So while we're on that topic, there's a new development that we're looking at in respect of the death of a young man under questionable circumstances, right? The name we've been given is Ulysses Roca, I believe that's the name, where this individual was reportedly taken into custody. He was injured, and this is the allegation being made, that he was injured while in detention, and subsequently he has passed away. Whether or not his death is as a result of that injury or what the circumstances are, I know that the Commissioner of Police was asked the question yesterday for a comment as to what transpired there, and he had promised that that would be addressed today. So I just wanted to put that out there quickly, insofar as, it's a brutal
so
facial
I was made
injury
to
you've seen
understand
there.
that he did have a broken jaw, and he was picked up for breaking the curfew. The allegation being made by the family, and we want to stress that it's an allegation, we'll get official word from the police as the timeline of events and what took place, is that his death was a result of the injuries, but we cannot say that that's a fact. We will follow up with the police. But if he was, or if he did sustain these injuries while being picked up for breaking curfew, that in itself is an issue of concern, because we have seen just in the past few weeks where the police has made some I don't even want to say bad decisions, they've just been completely out of order when it comes to their behavior, from
you have
police
the case,
brutality.
The coercion, right?
Well, I mean, I think it was forced rape. I think that the commissioner started off with some very stern statements on the type of charges that would be brought. Those didn't follow through. He called it rape on television, but they weren't charged with rape.
We've
seen these things. And you see, I did want to make a point because I remember, in fact, we should say that as members of the press, we are considered essential services. However, one of the things I remember very early on was that we'd get essential passes to move around. That's never happened. I don't know who's gotten essential passes, but they haven't. But one of the things I think that the Attorney General said at that time, or the Minister of National Security, which was very concerning to me as a member of the media, but also as just a general citizen, where he said, why does the media have to be out after 8 anyway? What do they want to do? Watch the police do their job? What if the police doesn't want them to watch them doing their job? Now, I'm using my own words, but that's essentially what he said, and he said it on live television. I heard it, and I thought of incidents like this that would happen, and that's exactly what's panned out. You know, we have to be vigilant in this time, and where we want to have the greatest trust in our authorities, it doesn't mean that you just give people carte blanche with power and there's no one to hold them accountable. So that's a very serious allegation that's being made, and we're looking forward to seeing what the commissioner will say as a result of it today.
Well, as we have mentioned just a few minutes ago, if this is indeed the result of police brutality, as the allegation is being made, then it only serves to kind of confirm what the masses of us have been thinking and believing, based on clearly what appears to be an abuse of authority for members of the police department who are patrolling, who are tasked with ensuring that persons abide by the curfew regulations and what have you. Like I said, there were cases in the past where people have come forward to say, this is what has happened to me during this period of time that we're under. And so it's a very dangerous precedence being set if that were the case, right? But as
and there's
you mentioned,
video evidence. There was video evidence of the elderly man being brutalized. There's video evidence of the 2 persons that were forced to engage in a sexual act. So it's not that we are just going off assumptions here.
Yeah.
These things have been validated with proof. Now, I will be fair and say exactly what the commissioner says all the time. They're not all bad cops. There are lots of hard-working, dedicated police officers in this country. But it doesn't mean that you take your eye off the fact that some people will, in fact, use this power that's been granted to them to do things that they're not allowed to do, period.
Okay, so the final point that I want to touch on this morning also stems from a story that we ran last Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, where the agro-productive sector, and we're talking about those in the livestock business primarily, those dealing in cattle and swine, right? There's been this informal market for the export of cattle to Guatemala through Bullet Tree Falls Village, where we heard on record the village chairman of Bullet Tree Falls, Sabino Pinello, suggesting that a toll essentially be paid for passage of cattle through the community. And that toll, in his words, would help the village of Bullet Tree Falls. Now, there has subsequently been a letter that was sent to Prime Minister Barrow, and that was also CC'd to the economic czars, Dr. Carla Barnett and Christopher Koyi, in respect of what has been taking place in the livestock industry, where losses are being incurred this time of year, particularly because, one, the export of cattle has been brought to a standstill. So I will quickly read from the letter itself, and bear in mind it has been endorsed by 29 other business owners in this particular area of work. So it says here, as you are most assuredly aware, there is a large surplus of livestock and meat products in Belize, This is due to production cycles being designed for a booming tourism industry and export to Guatemala. Both of these market outlets have been abruptly halted. Further, local consumers will eat less due to decreased activity and lower funding levels in households. All efforts to move excess product must be made to slow down and hopefully stop the current dumping of meat products on the local market and the future culling losses of local livestock herds. Losses to livestock producers will also affect grain farmers, as a decreased demand for grains will then affect the local grain stocks and the price of the grain. Increased grain stocks and lower grain prices will result. The net effect of keeping the borders closed to the movement of livestock may be to collapse the large-scale grain and ranching industries for many years to come, as farmers will adjust production to match the real cash flow. It is important to note that the export of cattle and pigs into Guatemala is informal. Fortunately, there is a short-term solution to this issue. We propose the following solution to this issue. Formalize the current livestock border crossing within the National State of Emergency statutory instrument by declaring the crossings at Bullet Tree Falls, Cayo District, and Halacte, Toledo District as temporary official borders for livestock sales. Install temporary facilities and or personnel to facilitate the trade of livestock into Guatemala to be accomplished. And it has two other points, but this is the primary focus that I wanted to touch on, Marlene. We're looking at an industry that per annum brings in roughly $50 million in revenue, and the month of April going into May is what they would consider their high season, so to speak. And so for the past several weeks alone, they've realized losses of approximately $5 million because of the suspension of movement of cattle to the two informal border points. Yeah. Right? And so we're looking at a situation where in last week as well, we were reporting in our various newscasts the fact that a lot has been happening in the agro-productive sector. We're looking at the poultry industry, where quality, for instance, there's a surplus of chicken. Yeah. So there are deals for people to try to purchase as much as possible. Some producers are completely out of cold storage, so you have a lot of excess produce that is being dumped essentially. And so while there is enough food, the storage of food and how things are working in those respective areas are now of concern to farmers, to livestock producers, and those persons, Marlene.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think the store, and I mean, to put it into perspective, I think one of the things that we just have to keep in mind is that there's a certain prediction as to consumption, and then suddenly it stops, and it stops not just for Belizeans, but more so for the tourists who didn't come in. So there wasn't the demand in the restaurants and in the and in the areas that saw a lot of people visiting, and also as they pointed out, people staying at home don't move as much, and there just isn't as much buying.
One thing sorry, go ahead.
This is, we spoke with the CEO of Agriculture a while back, and I know that one of the things that they were keen on paying attention to is looking at how they can strengthen the agricultural sector during this time. We know that we have completely lost the leg of the table, which is tourism, and it was a very firm leg that we used in terms of our economy. And so this is a critical time to ensure that you can bolster the other sector, the agricultural sector, to kind of help to keep some inflows. I don't know what the response has been, or if there's been any holdup or concerns coming out of the government side as to why this letter has come out now.
Yeah.
I think one of the things to look at is the threat of passing the disease over borders. That's always one of the main concerns. That's why we've closed the borders. But there is, in fact, traffic coming in with cargo and other things as well.
Precisely.
So it'd be kind of the same situation, just in an informal border point.
One of the things that we must keep in mind here is that we are in the middle of a drought, right? So that affects agriculture severely in terms of livestock in terms of grains and other produce in that section, in that sector, sorry. So it is important for them to be able to move these animals across the border and continue with trade so as not to create a situation where they're stuck here. And then, if you recall last year, when we went through that drought, the cattle industry took a severe hit because the cows don't have the same weight because the grass dries up. It's a ripple effect, exactly. So it is important for these individuals to be able to move across their livestock and continue that trade.
Yeah.
So that's it. We're looking at all these stories. You can definitely tune in at 6 o'clock this evening where we'll have these stories coming up.
And of course, just in terms of updates with COVID-19, today makes 1 week since no new confirmed case.
Yes.
And that's, I mean, specific with the number of cases. So that's a, I feel, I keep on using the term, it's a nervous calm. I do want to say that in terms of numbers, there have been over 700 tests conducted so far. But a critical number that we don't want to lose sight of is that there's 75 persons under investigation, and we know usually that means they're in the process of being tested, to be tested, or being monitored in some way. So the total test is 762, 744 negative, and of course we're still at 18 confirmed cases and 2 deaths. I know there were some reports made over the weekend about recovered cases. We've not gotten any official word from the Ministry of Health regarding recovered cases. Last week we spoke with patient number 6. I mix up my numbers very often. And he spoke of looking forward to being declared recovered, and that means that he has to have 2 negative tests done, or 2 tests that the results are negative. So that is a process. If they get the first negative, you do have to make sure that they get a second negative for them to be declared recovered. So we haven't gotten official word on any recovered patients as yet. We've not gotten any word on new confirmed cases. And for now, we will take that as a sign of optimism that our social distancing practices may be working, but it doesn't mean, as the Attorney General says, we don't drop the ball.
One other quick important thing, Marlene. At 10 o'clock this morning, the Ministry of Education will be having a press conference and to provide an update as to where we are with the academic year.
Yeah, the kids were supposed to go back to school today.
Students on a whole are still out of school, and so we'll get an update. What we'll aim to do, it's at 10 o'clock, we'll aim to air it live so that persons at home and persons who are on their mobile devices are able to view, to get an update as to where we are and what happens next insofar as the school year. All right, so that's coming up at 10.
All right, so that's it for us with the Eye on the News. And we get moving into our programming for today. And we're going to start off with a conversation with internist and intensivist, Dr. Jorge Hidalgo. We're going to try to understand a bit about COVID-19 and how it affects people and what we must continue to do to protect ourselves and minimize the spread of the virus in the country. That's going to be our first conversation.
Our second conversation is perspectives on the COVID-19 response, putting it all on the table. So we'll get a point of view from Carolyn Trent Sandiford to share with us her take on how the government has been able to respond to the coronavirus crisis.
All right, and here's another one. Wearing a mask. A lot of people are out there using their masks. They're being responsible about trying not to transmit the virus. It still is one of those topics where the World Health Organization says only sick people need to wear it, and healthcare professionals. We know the Prime Minister has encouraged people to wear masks. So we are going to talk about how to do so properly. So wearing it is not enough. You need to know how you're supposed to handle it, how you're supposed to use it to maximize protection.
And of course, our Kids Time presentation this morning will be focusing on teaching children about earthquakes.
All right, so that's what we have lined up for today. We're going to go ahead and take a break. But before we do, we have a birthday shout out.
We are saying happy birthday to Crystal Samos.
All right, we hope you have a great day today. Do enjoy, and you know, if you're locked down with your loved ones, you can have a nice small party right there. But do make the most of it. That's from all of us here at Channel 5 and Open Your Eyes. We're going to go ahead and take a break. When we come back, we'll be talking to Dr. Jorge Hidalgo. So please stay tuned.
With over 100 years of service excellence in Belize,
no new cases. I described to Isani earlier, for me personally, I feel a nervous calm. It feels like a nervous calm because practically speaking, we are probably going to be seeing more cases. Is that the case?
Well, we can look at it in two ways. Now, one is that the measure that was implemented by the Ministry of Health as well, the people adhering to those, it seems that it's showing a good results. No, that means that this is a combined effort between the public and the Ministry of Health, and I'm glad that things are okay. Of course, one of the most important things with this pandemic is that it's unpredictable. No, of course we can have, as you say, kind of sense of comfort, but we need to be very, very careful. No, as what is going to happen this next week. But I'm optimistic that things are going to be under control.
Okay. Is this an indication that we may be successful in flattening our curve here in Belize?
We can say that, no? That so far we are being successful. And again, we need to applaud the public, because that means that everybody is listening and taking it as serious as we should.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think in moving around the city, I can tell you that people are staying home. They are paying attention to the protocols that are in place. Now, we can't drop the ball on this issue. We have to ensure that we're doing all we can to reduce the spread of the virus over time. Now, one of the things that happens is that we pay a lot of attention to international news and the information that comes out from international organizations like the World Health Organization, PAHO, CDC. And the most recent information that came out last week, as we learned more about the novel coronavirus, is that there are many more asymptomatic carriers circulating in populations than we first imagined. Can you explain to me what that means?
Well, as you know, and as we also learn every day, that the virus, it behaves different in country by country, as was mentioned the other day. You know, as you see, even in the United States, you can see that the virus is being impacted in different ways to different cities, and it depends on several points. No one, if we probably look to New York, it's a very dense city with subways, with different ways of transportation, and that of course put the people to a different risk of exposure, different to other countries. I believe our country, in a way, we are blessed because we don't have this density of population, and that in a way it's helping us. Of course, the concern is those carriers of the virus that they don't exhibit symptoms. No, 80% of the population, as we know, are going to be asymptomatic. That means that they are not going to exhibit any fever, any cough, but they are carriers of the virus. And that's the importance that we stress to the population, that we need to wear masks when we are going outside, because that way we are protecting each other. No?
So explain, what happens is someone comes in contact with the virus and then they feel nothing. How do they transmit it if they're not symptomatic, if they're not coughing or dropping droplets everywhere?
Well, as we know, as we mentioned already, one of the things is that just the way of speaking, we will be able to disseminate the microparticles, no? Just the way to speak. And we don't necessarily need to cough. And that's the reason why the 6 feet, it became one of the rules, because we realized that it's not only of coughing, but just to speaking, that we'll be able to transmit the microparticles, and that's the importance for us to adhere to the 6 feet. And also, in some cases, that this is not easy to do, because we need to go to a market or pharmacy, and then sometimes we're in a meeting and we are unable to do that. then that's the importance for us to wear a mask.
Do we have an idea of more or less how long an individual can remain asymptomatic? Is it for the same period of time as though you're fully infected with COVID-19?
In average, it's going to be like that. When we have a 14 to 21 days that we need to be careful and observant. Of course, in the case of asymptomatic, and also if we don't know that we have the virus is a little bit more challenged. That's the problem. No? It's easy if we are tested. If I test today, I'm positive and I don't have any symptoms, and then after 7 days, if we don't exhibit any symptoms, in some countries they allow the people to go back to work with a mask all the time. Before entry, they work, they need to take the temperature, take the temperature at midday, take the temperature at the end of the day, and then that is the rule for an additional week. But again, in cases that we know, but it's those that are in contact, those that we don't know is the main problem.
This is looking a bit forward. I'll ask you the question nonetheless. How do you see us returning to a sense of normalcy after the state of emergency period has elapsed? We'll go back to school, we'll go back to work, whatever the case may be. How do you envision that? Because COVID-19 isn't going to go away anytime soon, so there's still going to be that fear that it is among us somewhere.
Well, that's a very interesting question, because of course, how we are going to back to a new normal is going to be strategized. We can't go back to normal suddenly. It needs to be done on a very step-by-step ways, in the sense that we can realize that at the moment when we're trying to back to normal, at the moment that we see an arise of new cases, we need to be able to back to lockdown again.
Wow, that's an interesting perspective. You know, Dr. Hidalgo, you are a member of the International Critical Care Society, and so you have the insight of what's taking place in other parts of the world. We were late in terms of the spread of the virus. We only confirmed our first case a month ago. What are some of the lessons that we can take from other countries that have been able to mitigate the spread and some who have faced severe outbreaks?
That's a good question. Just this morning we have a Zoom meeting with the World Federation of Societies of Critical Care, and we were discussing the same thing. Why some of the countries probably they failed at the beginning, and what are the success of other countries, like South Korea is a good example. No? They strategize, and how they strategize that the coronavirus. No? Of course, they have the ability to do a different way of testing, and also we have other countries that probably they didn't have the same experience. Like probably the example is Italy, that they start late, and then they have this amount of cases and deaths at the beginning. No? Yeah. I mean that, and in the other things also we were discussing what is going to happen with Africa and some countries that they have definitely their minimal resources. No? We are lucky in a way that we have certain capacity and access to equipment and things, but there are countries that they don't have that ability, no? And that we were discussing that how we are going to address and help those countries trying to educate and trying to essentially use minimal things to control that. And I believe the most important thing is in countries with a dense population is the wear of mask.
Yeah, yeah. And what about testing?
Well, testing is a challenge not only for us, it is a challenge everywhere. As you know, if right now, just to give you an example, if you want to buy a machine, a PCR machine, which is the standard and gold standard testing, yeah. If you want, then you put your order, and they probably can provide you the machine, but in terms of testing, it's a quote by country. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you say, okay, I want to buy 2,000 kits, they will say, okay, we will dispense X amount of kits this month, and we will dispense it in a step-by-step way. They are not going to sell you the 2,000 kits because everything is based on quotes. Since at this point, PCR is the only gold standard, none of the rapid tests are validated for acute phases.
Now, can you, I mean, that's a very medical perspective in helping us understand. I know that the Belizean public, quite rightly, if they do their own research, they realize that countries that have seen less devastation from COVID-19 had more testing. But what are the barriers locally? So you talk about quota system, the PCR machine, which is a very, it's an actual equipment that you use in the labs, and that's how we're able to test locally.
Yes.
But is it practical for us to believe that Belizean, that we as a country can move towards a mass testing protocol?
Well, it's something that they are discussing, in a sense that probably you are going to see some areas that they will put some tents that will be able to increase our ability to test. Okay. As far as I understand, we have enough kits right now for our population, and some more are coming. I believe the Ministry of Health is also looking on different strategies to increase the amount of testing that compared to what we're doing right now.
Essentially, testing has become a part of our new reality going forward as well, right? Because we will have to continuously be doing so, notwithstanding the flattening of the so-called curve, correct?
Exactly. We need to, at the same time we are observing the flattening of the curve. Also, there are many strategies that it needs to be done to ensure that we continue that way.
Yeah. Now, there's also of recent been some research out about the antibodies test. What's your perspective on that?
Well, right now, just to give you an idea, if I test positive today with the PCR, the gold standard, and then I want to know what is happening, then in a month time, I can do a test that will essentially measure the memory, and it said that I've been infected with the virus, and now I'm cured, but I have a memory in the body that will tell me that I've been in contact with the virus, that I'm not active, but I've been in contact with the virus to test the antibodies.
Okay.
Is it to say then, and this is purely theoretical at this point, that perhaps once you've contracted COVID-19 before, that if you were to contract it a second time around, your body would be more prepared or adept at dealing with the virus?
Definitely. We will definitely immunity, and we'll be able to fight the virus in a better way. That's what we are expecting for the future. That if that is something that is going to become seasonal, because that's some of that expectation that we have. It's nothing that we can conclude, but it's something that we are expecting that at some point it will become seasonal, and then all of us we will need to develop certain immunity to the virus, as well as the most important thing is developing the vaccine. But the vaccine, we were talking about probably 12 to 18 months looking ahead.
Yeah, and there's the development of the vaccine, and there's also access to the vaccine.
That is definitely two things.
Yeah. Now let's look at what we are seeing locally, and I know that you've had some experience with some patients so far. We have clearly been able to read information, see news stories and international coverage on just the range of how COVID-19 may affect people. And where preliminary the information coming out of China was that it would only severely affect elderly and those with predispositions or other conditions. We're seeing that different age ranges are affected. Some people require hospitalization but not intensive care. talk to me about how it affects different people and what we have learned now 4 months after the discovery of the virus.
Yeah, well, every day we have new information, and also we have new things that we are discovering with this virus. As one of our colleagues was saying last week, at this point there are no experts in this virus. All of us are learning every day. I mean that every country is sharing their own experiences. And what you say is true. At the beginning, we was thinking that probably only the elderly people with certain medical background are going to be affected, but that changed. We're seeing right now that everybody at any age can be contracted the virus. Also, the range of symptoms and signs have been different. At the beginning, we was focusing only on the respiratory system that definitely is the most affected, but also we are seeing many other manifestations. We see some skin changes. We can see some neurological symptoms, respiratory symptoms. Also, since the virus, it creates an incredible and very disorganized inflammatory response in the body. Also, we are noticed that the body, it increases his ability to clot, and then we will see many patients with clottings like pulmonary embolism. We see patients with ischemic stroke. That means that the clots are affecting the flow of blood to the brain, as many other symptoms, but also the more relevant that we are noticing now, and that also increase the rate of mortality.
Yeah. So the reason I asked that question is because where we have learned, and you're right, because they're even looking at how some people are in need of dialysis treatment after contracting COVID-19. Just the range of symptoms and complications they can have are so vast. So what does that mean for the preparedness here in Belize for our intensive care isolation unit? Because from what we've been told, it was primarily focused on the respiratory challenges that patients would potentially have.
I will tell you something that is a very encouraging, even that despite of our resources in the country, Dr. Arriaga and the team in Carl Kirchner, they start to prepare the COVID-19 unit several months ago. They was conducted training, even that we don't have patients, they were conducted training day by day in a different ways, training with equipment, training as how we are handling the patients, training as how to deal with mechanical ventilation. And also one of the things that we discussed at that point is that also we need to have the ability to dialyze patients in the COVID-19 unit. That is also one thing that we are able to do in case a patient he will develop acute kidney injury. You know? Since I mentioned in some of the presentation before, it's a cascade of events that start with the entry of the virus in our respiratory system, and then after the respiratory system is being affected, then this cascade of inflammation is slowly, essentially take our patients to something that we call it a multi-organ failure, meaning that one of the most sensitive organs immediately is the kidneys. We can develop acute kidney injury immediately, after we start to develop multi-organ failure. We don't see any patients so far right now with acute kidney injury, but this is something that we expect in an acute ill patient.
Okay, so you're already prepared for that. That's what you're saying, or we are already prepared for that.
We are ready for that. Also, the COVID-19 unit also is the plan in the case, and again, we hope that is not the case. In the case of, for some reason, we can overwhelm, is also a plan of expansion immediately to other areas that are already prepared.
Yeah.
If we're looking at the healthcare system from a broad perspective, and you're talking about the possible impact of coronavirus on the kidneys as a result of perhaps an individual becoming afflicted with COVID-19, when we look at the fact that there has always been an urge or there's a clamor for dialysis machines and for treatment for kidney patients. Is it that perhaps this area of the health sector can become overwhelmed? Is that a possibility that we're looking at persons who would have contracted COVID-19 and end up surviving it, but having overcome it means that they would now become kidney patients, so to speak?
No, we need to understand that acute kidney failure is different than a chronic kidney failure.
Okay.
In an acute kidney failure, we have a window of 3 weeks.
Okay.
I mean that when we discover that the patient have an acute kidney injury, we initially do something that we call it a fluid challenge to see if the kidneys are going to respond conservative. Of course, that is a very dynamic situation. It's nothing that we sleep on. We need to see what happens in the next 12, 24 hours. And if the kidneys are not responding, then we know that the patients will need something that we call it a kidney replacement therapy. That is basically they put the patients on a dialysis machine. And from that point, we will have a 3 weeks period where the kidneys can come back to normal. It could be any time between, sometimes the patient needs only 3 or 4 sessions and then the kidneys back to normal.
Yeah.
And but we can expand up to 3 weeks.
Okay, got it.
Now, when you talk about this level of care, I think there is a natural assumption that people have that once you're hospitalized for COVID-19, that this is the level of treatment that you may be receiving. In fact, in Belize, we have 2 patients that are hospitalized, but they're not on ventilation and they're not requiring this extreme level of care. Talk to us about the treatment that takes place in the hospital that is necessary for COVID-19 patients.
Yes, well, as we mentioned, 80% of patients are going to be asymptomatic. That means that they are not going to require any hospitalization as such.
Yeah.
20% of the patients and more or less 15% of the patients, it will develop a moderate illness that they will require support. That means that we will monitor, they will require IV fluids, they will require oxygen and continuous monitoring to prevent for these patients to go to a necessity of being on ventilation.
Yeah.
And then that period it varies. No, we can the first initial phase could be just minimal and last 1 week. The second phase, we see all these moderate symptoms. And in this second phase, at any point in time, the patients can go either way. So either we can continue with the conservative treatment, but also the patient can go to a phase that we need to offer all this type of support.
Yes, yes. You know, and this would be why you'd have to identify your symptoms early rather than waiting until you're severely ill. Would you agree
That's
with
right.
that?
Totally agree. And as I say, one of the advice we usually say is, if you for the listener, is that if you start to develop any fever or cough, contact immediately the hotlines, and they will give you instructions as what to do and also as how to be able to be tested. Yeah. Because it's important to recognize the condition earlier rather than you became very complicated and ended in an ICU.
Yeah. So Dr. Hidalgo, this brings one final issue to the forefront, and I got to say that we have some very brave persons in this country that did test positive for COVID-19 and have disclosed their identity and spoken up about challenges with stigma. Many experts have likened the stigma to COVID-19 as to what we saw with HIV back in the 80s, and just if we continue to stigmatize patients and become so almost obsessed with working out their details publicly, that it can have an adverse effect on people accessing healthcare early.
Exactly, and that's also is an important point that you mentioned, because people became afraid to go on testing, you know, and then they will be at home thinking that if they go public, it will create a stigma and discrimination. But also, I want to mention something. In some countries, either the healthcare workers that are in the front line, they are being discriminated, and in some countries, even if you live in an apartment complex, the people that live in the apartment complex are not allowing the doctors to go into the apartments, as well as nurses. I mean that this thing of stigma and discrimination is not only for the patient but also for the healthcare workers. I'm glad that the population of Belize is being very supportive to the frontline workers, and I'm applaud that the Belize population is being essentially very supportive. As you see, some people are sending different type of food or donation to the people that are in the front line.
Yeah.
And I think so we need to do that and continue fighting the stigma and discrimination.
And just lastly, while we all sit at home and jump on the internet and demand for testing and all the other precautions that we think is necessary, we can't forget our own individual responsibilities.
That is important. Again, coronavirus is a social responsibility, and we need to be aware and also to be protected from each other. And that's why we need to adhere to all these different measures that it seems to be difficult sometimes, but it's the time we're living. We're living in challenging times. It's not only Belize, it's everybody in the world. But I think so we are living in a very blessed country. We have a population that glad that adhering to all the measures, and we are doing good, and we can do better. But don't take this for granted.
Yeah.
The COVID-19 is serious, and hopefully we continue doing the way we are.
Well, thank you so much for talking with us this morning, helping us to make sense of all the information that is out there. We appreciate it, and take care. Stay safe.
Thank you. Same to you. Have a nice day.
All right,
All
Doc.
right. There you have it. That was Dr. Jorge Hidalgo talking about the latest with COVID-19, just looking at the data and the research that that is being uncovered as the world learns and tries to understand this virus better. But with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break. And when we come back, we're going to be hearing from urban planner Carolyn Trench Sandiford. And she has a couple of points looking from an urban planning perspective as to what we need to be looking at this phase of the pandemic. So that's coming up after the break.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.
We're back.
We are back and ready to get into our second conversation this morning. It is a perspective on the response to COVID-19 thus far. With us via Skype is urban planner Carolyn Trench Sandiford. Good morning, Carolyn.
Good morning, and it's always a pleasure to be on Open Your Eyes first thing in the morning. The only thing I'm going to miss today is to get that little smooch to say, hi, good morning, great seeing you. But I'm sending it virtually nonetheless.
I
Nice.
know. That's the part of the social distancing that's the hardest for me.
Yes.
Not greeting with a hug or kiss. But it's great to see you. And, you know, I think you have such an interesting perspective in terms of looking at or COVID-19 response. Now, as an urban planner, one of the things that you will always look at is change and responsiveness to change and preparation for change and execution of change. And while this may be a health crisis and a financial crisis, there's a whole lot of change involved as well.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I kind of hallmarked in 2 articles that I had written on the issue was that we need to look at it as a potential disaster and not solely as a health epidemic.
Okay.
And I think if we start looking at it as a potential disaster, then we will be definitely looking at varying components of that disaster. And I think that is where we need to start going.
Yeah. So, you know, that's an interesting take because it's a tough call. And I want to be clear, you know, the authorities are facing something like this for the first time. This is not a hurricane.
Absolutely.
This is like the hurricane came and wiped us out. Look at the shutdown in the tourism industry. But there's a tsunami coming, so instead of getting out there and saving people or doing anything, you have to let people remain safe until that tsunami passes. So it's difficult to be able to have measured responses or predictable responses because there still is this uncertainty of how much COVID-19 will spread, how fast it will spread, or how severe it will spread.
Absolutely. And I think, again, if you look at what you said it's unpredictable. Yeah. Clearly, COVID-19 is novel. So we are learning as we are going along. But while we are learning as we are going along, we also have to find ways in which we can be iterative in our decision making. And I see some elements of that within the COVID-19 response. However, what I am not seeing yet, and it doesn't mean that it is not happening, is how we start talking about resuscitation and recovery. And if we don't look at knowledge platforms, for example, how is it that we are documenting what we are learning, what worked, what did not work? How is it that we are leveraging the assets that we have? Yes, it's new, but there are some components of it that you can look at, as I have previously said, as a potential disaster. For example, let us look at the assets that we have. One, if you look at disaster management and disaster and emergency response, there are phases to it.
Yes.
There is preparation, there is response, there is recovery, and there is reconstruction. So you have the phases that are there. You also have different structures in place that have a combination of state and non-state entities. Because you have the government as well as you have some aspects of civil society. And then you have it operating at different levels, at a national level, at a municipal level, and at a village council level, at a village level. So you already have these structures in place with people who have a wealth of knowledge and experience in working on the emergency situations, as well as working with vulnerable populations who are the ones who are disproportionately impacted on. I heard you talking a little earlier, for example, just as an example, of the whole issue of dialysis and the impact this whole COVID-19 have had on persons who have to get treatment for dialysis. Now, if you are working with the structure that's in place, you would have had a Belize Diabetes Association, for example, or the people who are functioning in the dialysis response. And they would have been able to tell you where our dialysis patients are, what would have been the impact, and so the response then would have taken them into consideration. Another critical example is the villages. There are many villages who don't have water systems. Yet one of the key mitigating measures for COVID-19 has to do with washing your hands. So if you don't have water, how is it you're going to wash your hands? So you have to then respond to those using the structures. Now, it doesn't mean that you use a structure, only that structure. You then adapt that structure because, of course, there is the health component. And I, for one, believe that the health component has been doing a wonderful job. I was listening earlier to your conversation, and the fact that we have 18 cases and 2 deaths, unfortunately, does speak to some extent that we've been, at least so far, coping. But
so let me just dive in here for a second. So the article that you penned, putting it on the table, had a breakdown of different areas, including leveraging the assets. And you know, when I read it, I was most surprised because it seems so commonsensical. Like, and I don't know, I can't say with certainty that these issues have been looked at. You mentioned the dialysis patients, for example. I can start with that one because I did a story on it last week, and it is a heartbreaking situation where dialysis patients cannot get to their dialysis because there is no public transportation. Last Friday, I confirmed that one young woman died as a result of not being able to pay or make her way out from Stann Creek to Belize City for her dialysis treatment. So what has happened is that we put these regulations in place, but we haven't done the checks with institutions. I can say as well that the Dangriga Cancer Society or people seeking cancer treatment are also facing the same situation. How are cancer patients getting to Dangriga for treatment? If they have to pay for it, how are they going to pay for transportation as well? Because it has to be private at this point. So you talk about looking for the data where it exists. SIB, Diabetes Association, Kidney Association, Cancer Society, and getting the numbers, the elderly population, and get numbers and locations and statistics and start with protecting those who are most vulnerable. That's the premise of your point.
Exactly, but also I think when I noted the issue that we have to look at it as a potential disaster, also took into consideration that because you cannot look at COVID-19 solely as a health epidemic, and you can look at it only as response in terms of the norm, you also have to look at what are the pre-existing conditions. And I think this is where it comes in, because it's not just health. We have to look at issues of poverty, for example, because when you talk about locking down the country and you're dealing with scenarios where people are what you call catch and kill, they're day to day. They don't have storage, they may not have electricity, they may not have a fridge. There are many other issues that come into effect. So I think what has been happening, the government, to what I am seeing, and I can only go, let me be clear that I can only go by what I see reported, is that they are responding, but I don't think they're sitting down and actually looking at it and say, well, if I do this, this could be the impact. But not only what could be the impact, who are the people that we need to consult? And I think that may be a bit absent, and this is why I'm saying that, yes, it's a learning experience, and we have to treat it like that, and we have to know that mistakes will be made because it's new. But as we are going through it, let us start documenting what worked, what did not work. Let us use the data, as you have rightly said, that we now have and are even gaining. Let us look, for example, on the unemployment benefits that were applied for. My understanding was that it was over 60,000. And I think at the time, if I looked at some potential data, you were talking at that time about 30% of the population that have the age group to work. It doesn't mean that everybody within that age group can work, but just on a rough scenario. Let us look at who are the people who are employed. There was an initial emphasis on the tourism sector, for example. So we kept hearing a lot about tourism, but it is not only the tourism sector that is going to be affected. So this data now that you're going to have is going to talk to you about where people are applying from, what back trade they're coming from, age, sex, and so on and so forth. So you can start feeding this into the recovery.
You're speaking of demographic information at this point, essentially.
Exactly. But not only that, because remember, you're talking also not just the age, sex, and so you're also talking about the economic side of things, because you're looking at what background, what trade are they coming from, where were they employed. This becomes crucial if we start to talking about how we need to diversify our economic recovery and resuscitation. It becomes also important to know what areas of the economy are going to be on hold, because if we're looking at tourism, for example, you're talking about when we are now in the height of the tourist season. So this is going to close off, and the next season comes back in, I think, November. But how is it that we start to move towards becoming a more resilient Belize, meaning that if we are more diversified in our economic base, then another COVID-19 or 20 or whatever comes at us, we may be more resilient. In other words, the impact would not be as devastating as we are now seeing it.
Well, this
so
is
how we use the data as we are moving along becomes very key in terms of iteratively looping it back into the decision making as to how we start to prepare for post-COVID-19.
But this is the wake-up call that perhaps we've all needed as a nation to realize that we can't hedge all our bets, or we can't place all our eggs in the so-called tourism basket. Because we're looking at a situation now where the recovery will force us to have to diversify. We can't only simply base on strengthening or rebounding within the tourism sector if we're not looking at agriculture, if we're not looking at other areas of productivity as well, correct?
Absolutely, but also we have to start looking at what that data is saying to us about our vulnerable populations. When you look at the pictures, for example, of where let us look at the pantry system, where you're seeing the long lines for people who need to apply for pantry, when you're seeing 60,000 people applying for unemployment benefits and so on and so forth. It is also telling us that we are now seeing the manifestation of blatant economic and social injustice that have manifested to where we are today. So our recovery efforts is not just about looking at economic indicators. We also have to start to look at human development and social well-being indicators. How can we make our population more resilient? So the economic recovery and the sustainable livelihoods concept has to start coming into the play. So it's not just about, let us get the traditional economic activities back. No, it's about diversification of the economy, but it is also to ensure that the wealth of this nation gets trickled down to those vulnerable populations so that they can have a better quality of life. So when another pandemic may come around, the government doesn't have to put out so much, and we can recover faster.
Well, I think one of the things that we have said repeatedly, time and time again, maybe even in our own personal lives, everybody can be just one paycheck away from poverty. And there are some people who are 3 paychecks behind, or even more, depending on when they were forced to close or when they were no longer allowed to work. So we know that people who perhaps were, doing okay are now definitely not. They're facing the reality of not being able to provide. So a pandemic, let's be clear, is a major blow, and it's not anything that anyone can play a blame game with. It's here, and we're figuring out our way through it. But what I like is that you're saying, let's we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna trip a bit, but let's just get our stride right. Let's go back and check the data of who the vulnerable populations are, not just health-wise, but economic-wise.
Exactly.
Even looking at dense areas, because we know population density may have an impact. In other words, if I live in a yard that has 25 people, social distancing is anything but impossible.
Absolutely.
So those are
And
some of the
so
things.
there I talked about how we can leverage our assets in that just recently, for example, the Statistical Institute of Belize underwent a national georeferencing to prepare for the population census.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of data that we have that we can start looking at. And again, if you work with the municipal authorities, if you work with the village councils, you can start identifying where are these areas that we're going to have challenges with and start preparing for them. Even when it comes, for example, to the distribution of food. If we're talking about things like social distancing, you can't have these what I call centralized locations for the distribution of pantry. Why not create community banks where you have less people, it is easier to social distance, less people interacting so that they can get the necessary food. So I think these are some of the things we are, as we continue to say, we are learning.
What you're saying is
earlier, Marlene, regarding the issue where it's different from a hurricane. Because if you recall, when we do have a hurricane, yes, it's a lockdown. To a large extent, it would affect maybe one part of the country. So the rest of the country can maybe come in and assist. The rest of the world would come in and help us. But when the rest of the world is in the same boat as
we got to paddle for ourselves.
Thank you.
Exactly. Let me just move to the second point, because you mentioned the pantry system. We have the images up. Clearly, these people aren't standing in a line in the hot sun in vain. They want to have access to affordable food under the pantry system to be able to provide for their family. So I think sometimes we have to release ourselves of the judgments that we do have. But what your second point is kind of tackling this, which is we need to be innovative in this time. It's fascinating to see how businesses in Belize have wholeheartedly embraced online services. Because when you are forced to, sometimes you must innovate as a matter of survival. But that also expands to other programs, perhaps like the very pantry that we're looking at this issue here.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you quite hit the nail on the head, because oftentimes it's in times of adversity that innovation springs. And what this is saying to us is that Belize has a lot of potential. It has a lot of untapped potential that if encouraged, that if the environment is there to facilitate unleashing this potential, there's a lot that can happen. And so we need to start looking at how, for example, how technology can better be used to provide better services for these particular communities. One of their toolkits, for example, that we have seen where people can immediately put in information, gives their location, and you can know exactly where you have challenges for food. So it's not necessary that people go to a centralized point. So these are some of the things that we need to start looking at, how people can gain access to vital information. There are issues, for example, when it comes to medicine and getting educational resource material. As far as I recall, Marlene, and I'm not sure if you all have seen any latest data on things like cell phone penetration into Belize. But if you look at that data, I mean, nearly everybody in Belize have a smartphone. So how can you use that?
SIB does have that data, just to say.
Exactly. So how can you use that data and having people who have their smartphones, because you are going to have issues. The issue is not just one that is linked to COVID-19. You do have other medical information. One of the things that captured my attention, for example, was when I was watching at the two deaths. Unfortunately, two persons that I knew. There was this scenario where persons went to private sector institutions
Facilities, yeah.
prior to going to the health system. How can we get information more to people to call or link back to the Ministry of Health systems?
Yeah.
Because everything is important. Time is
Yeah,
important. How do you deal with medical emergencies, for example, when you have people maybe in communities, let us say with London bridges?
Yeah.
You know, how is the ambulance going to get in there? How are you going to get people out?
Yeah.
So there's a lot that we can do in terms of innovation and adaptation. And it is not just about now. If you go back to South Korea and you go back to Taiwan, what you're going to see that one of their key strengths had to deal with data infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were tracking people on their cell phone to see if they were following
Exactly.
quarantines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So things like that, again, like I said, we are learning. And as
Yeah.
Belizeans, even though I use that word mistakes, people will tell you, I like to say, we don't have mistakes, we have experiences, and we learn from them.
Yeah.
So it is how we take and I go back to how we take what we have and we adapt as we move along. And in that way, then we can minimize the cost, the health, the number of lives that lost, but enable us as a people to bounce back quicker.
So can we reiterate what you're saying then by surmising or putting it together that perhaps the response from the government and all the various agencies need to be more data driven in terms of being as effective in reaching out to these vulnerable populations?
Absolutely, but not only data driven, it also has to be wider. In the point I have been making also is that we cannot just look at it as a health epidemic, but we have to look at it also as an issue of livelihood. And we have to take into consideration our pre-existing conditions, because I spoke of a pre-existing condition as poverty.
Yep.
But another pre-existing condition also has to be the whole issue of the government structure. The fact that you have a situation where people have low trust in government. How do you get out information to make people believe in what, in what is happening?
Yeah.
We also have the issue of the hurricane season coming up, for example. We have drought that is taking place.
Yeah.
So how do we create a government system that is not just data-driven, but a data system, a governance system that is integrated?
Yeah.
And I think that is what I find sometimes tend to be lacking with government response, that we tend to just be looking at, okay, this is happening, we will respond to it, but let us look at this happen, what all can be the impact of it.
Yeah.
And I think that integrated approach then lets you look at the economy, lets you look at the social issues, lets you look at infrastructure issues, and so on and so forth.
And I think that is a crucial point, because where we all are guilty of first just looking at this as a health issue, and we wanted to see health personnel directly addressing it, as time goes by, the picture broadens, and we know that it includes kind of the economy of the country, but most importantly, just the individuals and how we're affected. And
absolutely,
it's unfortunate we're not going to have the census, because we won't have the updated poverty numbers. And now with COVID-19, it will be completely skewed because this new tragedy will change the financial situation for many. But I want to go back to something. You spoke of the information flow and that people are accessing private health care instead of calling the hotline to get proper guidance. And when they access private health care, they're exposing people unnecessarily. So that really is your third point, and clearly because of our business, it's an important one. It's about communicating effectively. Because I'll tell you this.
And timely.
Because I'll tell you this. Every single press conference, there are multiple, we're running PSAs from February on Channel 5. All of this information is out there, that if you have the symptoms, you call, but we're still not seeing the level of action that we'd want to see. And it's clearly documented in some of the positive cases that we've heard. So it's effective communication that seems to be a challenge, and also timely. not allowing
Timely.
rumors to
And-
run for a long time.
Disinformation, and certainly it also has a lot to do with how you target your messaging, because a message to you and me may not necessarily be how we interpret it, may not necessarily be how somebody else interprets it.
That's right.
And when you had the scenario, remember when there was a scenario of the SI, where the Attorney General comes out at 9:15 on, I think it was the day before the SI was supposed to become effective, to explain it. You had an attorney who understands the law, who then says, no, what he's saying is illegal. And then saying to the commissioner, this is on social media, that the commissioner must not enforce it. And then coming back, accepting that the person accepted that they were wrong, came back and say, well, yes, it is correct, but it had to be read in conjunction with another SI.
Yeah.
Now, Marlene, how many of us are going to look at two SIs?
Even if we do, how many of us can understand
The
it?
language.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Understand that language.
Yeah.
So that
and having an
becomes
attorney
very-
explain it isn't always better because they still talk
Exactly.
legalese.
So it's how you take that message and target it to your varying audience.
Yeah.
Yesterday there was a major conversation again on social media where the one person was saying, the minister was saying, you cannot come out on a Sunday. They had issues because they had an elderly person that they provide food for. The commissioner comes out and said, well, you can take that out. But then the person is saying, but the minister is saying we can't. So who do you believe?
It was the same thing with exercising at one point too. It was,
Exactly.
no, you couldn't exercise. Yes, you can exercise. And then it had to be clearly stipulated.
And I think the commissioner, because the commissioner deals with the day-to-day scenarios.
The on-the-ground
People
scenarios.
are on the ground, so he is understanding what's taking place on the ground.
Yeah.
So when you say medical emergency, some people may say, oh, that if you're really sick, you have to ask for the ambulance or you have to rush somebody to the hospital. Yeah. But for others, that medical emergency may be, an elderly needs a medication at a certain time. They may be blind, they may be disabled. There are other issues that intersect. People, lots of our elderly population, you all know, live on their own. They don't want to leave their house.
Yes.
No care how you try, ask them to move and come live with you.
Yeah.
They don't want to leave. Yeah. So how do you deal with that? And I think those are where I call the mixed messages that we have to work on to ensure at the end of the day that we reach the right population with the right message at a particular point in time.
I mean, I think to be fair, the regulations are made for the better, for everyone. It's kind of like a blanket move. But there are anomalies in every situation. Not even anomalies. There's some populations that we perhaps don't think of how challenging it is. I think the self-isolation in an overcrowded house is one. I know the commissioner had to give special mention to say, don't worry, essential workers, you can still pick up your children after 4 p.m. Because we had another message being communicated that even if you're with your mom after 4, you're not supposed to. So
absolutely,
it's things like, I mean, I understand that we need to be stern, but it's the message somewhere.
Right.
So you talk of that being a part of the response that's important. And language, we've seen for the first time where Spanish translations are done for almost all the, we haven't seen this in a while. And I gotta say, I commended them for the sign language, but they had sign language before they had Spanish.
I was going to mention that as well because, and again, it goes back to learning, it's a learning curve. And I think this is where I keep emphasizing the importance of we're in uncharted waters. We accept that. Yeah. We accept we are going to have experiences that we are going to learn from. So this is why it's so important to document what we're doing, what is working, what is not working, what happens next, so to ensure that at the end of the day, if there is another one that comes at our doorstep, we are better prepared.
Yeah, and I have to say this much. I think that your point on communication effectively and timely. In terms of timely, I think we're doing a lot better than we've seen in many other crises.
Definitely, absolutely.
Yeah.
the
Absolutely.
online
Thanks to the
platform.
technology at hand.
Yeah.
And another thing, because when we were looking at adapting, for example, and messaging,
Yeah.
how a lot of the messaging really is by social media.
Yeah.
A lot of the messaging require internet infrastructure.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, as the experts, I mean, it's just a wonderful component of the whole messaging.
Yeah.
And all the media houses, including yourselves, are doing such a wonderful job in terms of getting out these public service and also having the conversation that we need to have, because as we have the conversation, we learn more.
Yeah.
Your experience is different from my experience,
Yeah.
but together we make one nation and one country. So it's very important that everything that we do, whether we are talking about economic recovery and livelihoods, whether we are talking about healthcare issues and messaging, whatever we do, we take into consideration we're dealing with a whole, but you have different groupings of people that you have to deal with differently.
Yeah. Yeah. And your final point, I don't want to lose time. We have to get to this one. It's about planning for economic resuscitation.
Absolutely.
I know that we're in a spot where it's hard to see the end, but we do know certain things about the end of whatever the lockdown, the state of emergency will be. We will have a very severe financial crisis locally, and also the implications of whatever financial crisis takes place across the globe. You're saying
Absolutely.
now is the time to plan.
Actually, we should have started already, but there is no better timing than starting now. And I think, again, I keep going back to this, that there is a lot of information, there's a lot of data that we now know that we can use in terms of the planning for the economic resuscitation and recovery.
Yeah.
I think what we're going to have to look at is that just as how COVID-19 kind of put a jolt in our lives, we have to think of some radical economic resuscitation and recovery plan that is going to jolt the economy. At this point in time, we really need all hands on board, and I think this is a challenge that Belize has continuously faced, that we seem to think that there are few people who have a monopoly over ideas. I think...
Well, I was going to ask that. Who should be involved in this type of planning?
Well,
Because
again,
naturally we want to think of economic experts, but
absolutely.
I also think sometimes not having people from the social sector involved, because the livelihood and the day-to-day experience of even your politician or your top technical people is a lot different from the people who are standing in that pantry line. So in perspectives...
Absolutely.
Shouldn't it be a well-rounded, holistic approach then that involves everybody from every sector of society?
Yeah, there is always a necessary for some entity to lead. And clearly that's why we elect governments. Governments must lead. But we have long moved away, and I've said this point already, have been big on the show. We have long moved away from government to governance. What we need to look at is a governance structure that is going to lead the effort. And that governance structure can't only focus on the big people, meaning the big economic players. Yeah. We need to understand what the small economic players, what has taken place in their lives. If you look at how we have been dealing with this COVID-19, you're going to see all the big people are still functioning. The poultry people, the big supermarkets, and so on. But what's happening to the tacos vendor?
It's
or the person?
Small businesses, yeah.
Pardon me?
It's the small businesses, the micro businesses.
Exactly. We have not even looked at how we could have integrated them into the whole this crisis period. One thing, for example, I remember seeing these little bicycle carts with their fruits moving around, and their vegetables. You can tell me why is it that we could not have them continuing, and you just link them to particular areas. You put your leaf vegetables for our bag, for our stick, you put it in the yard, then put the money on the stick and you take it out. That's how you adapt. Yeah. You get, so we need to, whatever recovery and resuscitated efforts, we need to include the macro players, and we also need to include the small people, but we also need to include the technological people. Because moving forward, COVID-19 has given us a sort of leapfrog into technology and how we use technology. we need to start applying our technology to our economic sectors and to our social sectors.
Is it fair to say?
So that process needs to start.
Is it fair to say that these are the experiences we would have learned now in order for us to plan ahead for another situation such as this, simply because no one foresaw COVID-19, right? And so we were waiting for it to get here as an inevitability. However, the window of time for all of this planning, we didn't have that. So I would want to think that fortunately, the government was proactive enough to at least get something going. But as we're saying, it's a fluid situation where we're learning as we go along. So therefore, some of the experiences that we're having now can help us to better prepare for another time around, which would perhaps include the micro players, such as the tacos vendors, the other small parts of the economy that is equally as meaningful as the big business.
Definitely, but also let me be clear that let us not in any way remove ourselves from the fact that governments ought to be engaged in scenario planning.
Yes.
We always must be ahead of the game. We must have teams within our government that are constantly looking at the radar. Things that we can tell you as planners or economists or so is that you look at what's happening regionally, you look at what's happening globally, and it more or less tell you what's going to start coming at you. So you always have to be in this scenario planning. Admittedly, let us also accept that we are now moving in a time of unpredictability and uncertainty. Planning 25 years ago, you would have heard about long-range development plans and so forth. No, it doesn't mean you don't do that. But you have to have institutions that are more agile, that are more flexible. Leadership that understands that it's a parallel scenario while you're moving towards specific national development goals. At the same time, you're dealing with things that are coming at you. So your mind has to always be what is on the radar and what the impact of what is on the radar, how that is going to affect us. We knew COVID-19 was coming. That ought not to have stopped any planning that we are looking at for 2030 or 2040.
Well,
yes, we are learning, and sometimes what COVID-19 does to us is to say, okay, if we want to reach there, what is the impact it has happened, or where we want to reach, is that even relevant anymore?
Well, that's one of the things I wanted to ask, because, you know, we entered into this period or faced the pandemic right after the first budget reading. So there were all these projections made, but there was also allocation of funds for specific activities. I know the Prime Minister has talked about working with international institutions, financial institutions, about kind of reworking the budgets. But in my mind, some of the heavy tourism infrastructure that we felt was urgent now is probably not as urgent, and that money can be reallocated for other uses. I mean, provided that you can get the financial institutions on board. Let's use case in point, the $10 million road. I mean, how many tourists are going to be going to Caracol right now if that was such an urgent need?
Absolutely. And again, it doesn't mean that the Caracol Road may not be important in the scheme of things. But we have to be able to adapt and respond according to where the relevant needs. And I think one of the key things that we have to start looking at is how we start using this period to move towards economic diversity that looks at the big picture to ensure that every Belizean is going to benefit from the wealth of this country. I mean, that has not been happening. COVID-19 exposed that to us. And it also said to us in some ways that there are key policymakers who have not a clue as to what's happening on the ground. And so at the end of the day, these things have to come up to us. They're start. They have to come to us, and we have to take it into consideration in terms of moving forward.
It is a very delicate balancing act in being able to meet all the needs of right now, preparing the healthcare sector in the case of a worst case scenario, working with the people to avoid that worst case scenario, providing for whatever is lacking in terms of basic needs, while also thinking of how you will ensure that collectively we'll be able to survive whatever financial blow happens at whenever this
Absolutely.
ends. And
And
so,
you mentioned the budget. The reality that budget is no longer relevant.
Yeah.
yeah,
You know?
yeah,
That's the
true.
reality that we now face. But who would have thought of that 5-6 months ago? Clearly, and even what COVID-19 is saying to us is that we need to transform government.
Yeah.
We need to do a sort of radical transformation of the government to be able to respond more effectively to what is going to come at us in the future.
And just one last point, I think, because we brushed over it. It's also accountability, because we don't want to think of that
Absolutely.
right now, but there's no point in doing an audit 5 years from now. Let's just have full transparency from now as to where the monies are coming from, where they're going, what is being shifted in the budget, and let us know and understand as we move along. I think there's a lot of understanding for change, but we won't be naive enough to believe that we should always still demand transparency.
Absolutely, and I think what is also key, you did mention that, for example, the Prime Minister mentioned that there are international partners that are out there willing to work for us.
Yeah.
Let us be mindful also that we are also a country that is very high in debt. So our recovery can't be focused on borrowing more money. Our recovery is going to have to start looking at how we can leverage those assets that we continuously have, that we have within our own country, to remove that debt burden. That has to be key. Another thing that has to be key, and I continue to emphasize this, is that it is not just about economic indicators. It's about how we use this opportunity to start to recharge and resuscitate an economy to ensure that the wealth of this nation gets trickled down to those persons who have been excluded from the development process in this country.
All right. Well, you know, I'm always fascinated by how your mind works as a planner, because, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, it's just simple things that we have as an afterthought that can help us so much more if we include it as a part of our decision-making process.
Absolutely.
So thank you for sharing that with us this morning.
And it was my pleasure as usual, and I can get used to this virtual space thing.
No, we will get back to the days where we have human interaction again.
I heard you. There's going to be a new normal post-COVID-19. You just watch it.
All right, Carolyn,
Thank
stay
you.
safe, and thank you for your feedback.
You stay safe too, both of you. Bye-bye.
All right.
right.
Take care.
All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and take a break. Of course, the show continues. We'll keep on bringing you as much information as we can to help you to broaden your perspective. This next one, Isani, is really important. Dr. Hidalgo said it. You know, he believes that people should be wearing masks. The Prime Minister has advised the same as well. But there is something called mask etiquette, which means there's a right way and a wrong way. We're going to be tackling that after the break, so stay tuned.
COVID-19 is an infectious
And we're back, and we're moving into our next conversation for this morning. One of the things that we're told consistently as a means of protection if we have to go out into the public is that you can use a mask to help to protect yourself and to protect other people. And so joining us this morning, we have a dental student with us, Cassandra Gloria, and she is going to tell us all about the do's and don'ts of wearing masks. Good morning.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
I'm really good. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much. It's a great honor.
This is, really important conversation because none of us are accustomed to wearing masks. In fact, I find I touch my face more when I'm wearing a mask versus not wearing it. So it's a big learning curve for us.
Of course, definitely. Yeah, no, see, the thing with me is that I'm a dental student. So in the clinical practice, this is something that I have learned throughout my years of practicing, and we have to use a mask constantly. And so we have the etiquette, but a lot of common folk do not. And that's why I think that this is very important that we learn how to properly use a mask.
Yeah. So, as you said, as a dentist especially, because you're so close to someone's mouth and all the respiratory droplets that come with that, this is part of your foundation that you learn how to use a mask and use it properly.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's start off with our educational segment. I know you've been paying attention to people in the public. What are some of the things that you're seeing people do that you just like to tell them, don't?
Okay, definitely. I have some examples here of some masks, so I'm going to go ahead and put one on. This one was made out of cloth. I notice a lot of people are going to seamstresses to be able to make these kind of masks, and it's great. But what I'm noticing is that people are tending to do like this. And you see, if you notice, my entire nose is exposed. So I'm still inhaling any kind of viral particles that may be present. Or they take it off because, it's too hot, and they leave it on their neck. Whatever virus was trapped here is now in contact with your skin, is touching your face, and you're exposed. So these are things that we definitely have to practice to make sure that we don't have this issue,
Okay.
Yeah.
So don't hang it around your neck.
No, do not hang it around your neck. If you feel like you have the urge that you must take it off, it's better to take it off and dispose of it and get a new one, or to take it off, wash your hands. It's constantly a battle between washing your hands, putting on the mask, washing your hands, taking off the mask, washing your hands afterwards. So one thing that I definitely have to say is don't adjust it when it's on your face. Don't mess with it. Don't touch your nose, your eyes, and then, scratch yourself. That's putting you at risk. You're basically just going against the purpose of using a mask.
So once you have it on, the suggestion is that you leave it on.
Exactly. And to not mess with it constantly. If you have to take it off, you take it off, wash your hands, put on the next one, wash your hands. It's like a constant process.
Now, we noticed that while there are N95 masks out there for purchase, we're also seeing that persons are going a lot for the reusable masks. Those that are made from cloth or some other kind of material. Now, when we look at the etiquette of the use of reusable masks, how often would you suggest for these masks to be cleaned before reusing?
So definitely every time you leave the door and you have the mask on, when you come back home, take it off immediately, wash it immediately. That will prevent any spread of germs from outside into your home. So you definitely want to deal with that.
Okay.
Washing it as often as possible.
So, but that's if you put it on and you don't touch it and don't take it off until you return back indoors.
Definitely.
So, it's kind of just reminding us of the science as to how a mask offers protection. So in the United States, for example, it's now mandatory in some states for people to wear masks when outdoors. Explain to us how it protects us so that we can know why, the little things like taking a break because it's hot to wear or it's uncomfortable or itchy, taking little breaks in between actually it undoes the entire process of protecting yourself.
So basically what the purpose of these masks is to ensure that whatever particles are released from you are not spread to others, and whatever particles are spread from others are not contaminating you. So it's really important that when you use these masks, you're covering the entire surface of your face, You have, for example, in the case, a lot of people have these standard blue masks, right? The typical surgical mask. you have to ensure that it's completely open and it's wrapped around your face, and that you're pressing down on the nose here to ensure that it's really in there. And what you want to do is to basically make sure that you're not touching these constantly, because the whole purpose of the mask is to stop viral particles from leaving a person and viral particles from entering a person. So a lot of patients are, as we say, asymptomatic. Now, in regular terms, these are people who are sick or who have the virus but are not showing any symptoms, they don't have fever, they're not coughing, they're not sneezing. But simply by talking, they can be spreading these viral particles. So we don't want to have that happening any at all. So we definitely recommend that people use the mask and use it effectively.
All right, so you talk us through the process of putting on our masks.
Okay, definitely. All right, so I have an example here of a mask that a lot of people have been using. This one in itself is not capable of protecting you effectively. So what I've been doing is that I've been reinforcing them with a coffee filter. So you basically put a coffee filter. This is something that everyone has access to, so it's a simple process, right? You fold it in the shape of a half moon. You insert it into the part of the mask that will be contacting your face, and you have to make sure that the wire here, most of the masks have wires, even in these they have wires, as you can see at the top here.
Yeah.
So you have to make sure that that is facing upward, and that whatever color the mask may be is facing outwards. If you have it towards your face like this, it defeats the purpose. It's not serving you any function whatsoever. So you really have to make sure that you have it done the right way, because you could be wearing a mask but it's upside down, or it's inside out. So you have to really make sure that you're doing it the right way. So now that I've inserted my coffee filter, I'm going to basically put on a mask. Obviously, before doing any of this, your surfaces have to be clean, your hands have to be clean. That's why I have my hand sanitizer here, but I'm sure everyone has seen hand washing techniques by now.
Yeah.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and jump straight to the process, right? So as you can see, I put on my mask. I'm pressing down on the nose part here to make sure that it wraps around my face and it's covering everything.
Yeah.
Not very important. When I take off the mask, I am not going to touch here at all. I'm going to grab the straps and using only my fingers, remove and dispose immediately.
Yeah. Okay, so first thing, you have to have clean hands to put on your mask. You don't want to just,
Definitely.
like I wouldn't just get up from here and put on a mask. I have to go wash my hands before I put it on so it stays sterile. It has to be stored somewhere sterile. It can't just be hanging around on my counter and I put it on. Okay.
Exactly.
And then
There has to be new masks every time, or a clean mask if you're in the case of the reusable ones. Ensure that it has just been washed.
And the seal, I keep on hearing you talking about pinching the nose. The seal is essential. Can we talk about that? Because I've seen somewhere it's not covering their chin, or it's hanging halfway down their nose, or like I can see their mouth from the side because it's so loose on the sides. Let's talk about that part.
Definitely. So that's what I'm going to show you right here. As you can see, this is a little metal wire. What this metal wire is designed to do is to wrap around the nose to ensure that the mask is flat against your face and is hugging the contours of your face.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the mask also opens to ensure that you have your entire chin and lower face region inside the mask.
Okay.
So that's also very important. So when you place it on, remember to press it down. And then, of course, with these ones, you tie them behind the head and the neck. But it's to make sure that everything is wrapped properly. As you can see, nothing is exposed. You do not want to have the masks drooping, or I've seen some people that have it like this, just like that placed on, and you're not covering anything. So you want to make sure that you really get everything covered.
Okay. Yeah.
That's
And
interesting.
how about so Sandy mentioned like the N95 masks, and some people are reusing the same masks each day. What's your advice on that? I mean, it might be an availability thing.
Yeah,
which ones can you reuse, and which ones should you absolutely not even try?
Okay, any N95 mask or any mask that is intended to be disposable, like this one that I've been using or this white one, you need to throw those away and change them as frequently as often. However, I do recommend that in the case that you can't afford to be buying masks constantly, you can even do this with a cloth, where you open up the cloth, you insert the coffee filter as I mentioned, And you can basically tie it around your head or use rubber bands to put it on your head. And now with these ones, you change them by, like I said, when you leave the house, you wear it. When you come back home, you take it off immediately and you wash it. And that's a great way to prevent the spread of the disease.
Okay. What about I've seen people using like the fishing gear.
Or the neck gaiter?
Yeah. Does
I
that
think
work?
Sorry, continue.
No, I was asking you if that works as well.
I've seen a lot of people using that as well. Now, my thing is that if you're going to use any kind of fabric, just make sure that you basically double up the protection by inserting those coffee filters like I mentioned. Although I wouldn't really recommend using the fishing gear, because what happens is that you have to pull it over your face, so it's like making contact over your face, and when you're done you have to stretch it down, so you basically, there's no way for you to remove it without getting the front part of it all over your face. And so that basically defeats the purpose, so I definitely would recommend something that you can untie, or that you can, remove, like an elastic that you can remove it by stretching it and just pulling everything off without having it basically rub on your face,
Yeah. So another part that I hear from you is that in removing the mask, you also must be very careful. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, definitely. Now, like I said, if you're removing the mask and it's contacting your face, well, then that defeats the whole purpose. That's why I mentioned that when you remove the mask, you have to grab it by the rubber, but not touching your face. Grab it by the rubber, and you lift it up. And you notice I haven't touched the front part of the mask. My hands have not touched that mask, and the mask has not touched my face, and I can dispose of it. And it's very simple. So it's not a difficult technique. Obviously, with practice, you'll get the hang of it, but that's the best way to remove it, to ensure that you're not touching your face and spreading that disease that may be present on the surface of the mask onto your face and mouth, nose, eyes.
Wow. So, I mean, it's literally just kind of working under the assumption that you have virus particles on your mask and you just want to not come in contact with it at all.
Exactly. You have to constantly assume that you are contaminated, that the mask is contaminated. So the best way to prevent that, any kind of spread, is to, like I said, remove it the proper way, put down the proper way, and wash your hands. And obviously the best prevention is staying home. Stay home. It's that simple, So
if you stay home, you don't have to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Because you're in the same environment. Yeah.
Exactly.
And the cloth ones, what about moisture? Because, you have moisture in your breath when you talk, and it's the same thing with some of the lighter materials. Is it a bad thing if your mask gets wet? Should you change it?
Well, I would definitely recommend that if your mask gets wet from the outside, then you definitely should change it, But on the inside, that's the benefit of using the coffee filters. The coffee filters are basically trying to trap any moisture that you may be emitting, that you may be releasing from your body. So obviously these masks are not the most comfortable thing in the world. We all know that. I'm sure everyone who's been wearing them can say the same, But it's not a matter of comfort, it's a matter of safety. And more than anything, you may feel the urge to itch, to scratch, you may feel a little bit sweaty under there, but know that the mask is doing its job. That's the important thing.
All right, so key thing, cover your nose, pinch it to your nose, make sure it's flat to the contour of your face. Even if you're making your own, you want to consider that. And it goes under the chin as well, and don't touch your masks. Once you put it on with clean hands, don't touch it again until it's time to take it off, and specifically from another surface other than the one right in front of your face.
Exactly. So remove it from the elastics or untie it behind your head without making any contact with the surface of the mask whatsoever.
Nice. Any other final tips for us, Cassandra? Which one is the most comfortable that you found? Because they can be really uncomfortable.
Well, my all-time favorite are the ones that I use the most in the clinic, so they would be like these ones.
Okay.
But like I said, I would definitely recommend that you reinforce it with the coffee filters, as I mentioned before, because then that prevents any kind of spread of the smaller particles that, may not be that may be filtered through this, so it would prevent that from spreading.
So you still reinforce that one with a coffee filter?
That personally I do, and that's why I mentioned to all of my loved ones, I put up a video on YouTube about it, is that it's the simple way to just reinforce these masks, basically making them more effective and keeping yourself safe and your loved ones safe as well.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that advice with us as well.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, we appreciate the tips because,
definitely.
you know, we've all made a few mistakes with our masks so far, but we're not medical professionals, so we do appreciate it. All right,
Thank you.
stay safe.
Same to you. God bless. Stay safe.
All right.
Stay home.
I know. Stay home, stay safe. That's what we say.
Exactly.
And with that, since most of you are at home, it is time for us, Isani, to get moving into our final segment for today. And this is where moms and dads, you get a little break if you'd like it. You can get the kids, put them in front of the television because it's time for kids time. And of course, this segment is brought to you by J&W Shopping Mart, where you can do your online grocery shopping. Today, the kids are going to be learning about earthquakes, right?
Yeah.
There was an earthquake last week. Did you feel the tremors?
No, I didn't. But I was aware of it afterwards.
Okay. So the kids are going to learn about what is an earthquake. Let's get moving into kids time now.